back together. This is a new set, or the beginning of a new set of topics to talk about wireless. And I'm going to do the most significant thing that I have done all day, and that is to introduce Commissioner Mignon Clyburn.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. It only gets better from here, trust me. Good afternoon, everyone. You have had quite a busy day with 3 very engaging panels focusing on issues that go to the very core of any open internet rules, tailoring the policy to harms, the scope of any new rules, and ways to enhance transparency. The next panel will focus on the application of open internet rules to mobile broadband, an issue that continues to be very, very important to me. In voting to approve the open internet rules in 2010, I made quite clear that I would have applied the fixed rules to mobile services, often referred to as parity treatment. The world looks quite different than it did 4 years ago, particularly with regard to mobile services, including the increased use of Wi-Fi, deployment of LTE to 300 million Americans, faster speeds and connections, and increased use of mobile broadband, to name a few. Indeed, as the chairman mentioned last week, there were 200,000 LTE subscribers in 2010. Today, there are 120 million. Along with the technical changes, Americans' use of mobile devices has also changed rather significantly. The number of Americans who rely exclusively on a mobile device, according to a recent Pew Research report, is 41%. That is up from 29% just 4 years ago. For lower-income Americans, you've heard me say this, 56% are wireless only, and that is up from 39% back in 2010. And for Latinos of all income levels, the number of wireless-only households is 53%, up from 38% 4 years ago. For many of these lower-income households, for many Latino consumers, their mobile device is their only access to broadband, if they have broadband at all. I attended CTIA and CCA shows last week, and wireless providers made clear their views on open internet and concerns about parity. But one thing I did not hear, and I hope it gets more attention today, is the effect on consumers. If mobile broadband is your only access to broadband, what is the impact, if there are any, different standards? What applications may be blocked? Will providers disclose that certain applications may be blocked or that the experience would be different? And most importantly, if we have a different standard, will it disproportionately impact communities that rely on their mobile device for connectivity? Although I continue to keep an open mind, I must say that I have concerns about a possible lower standard for mobile services. But I appreciate Chairman Wheeler's leadership, which seizes the opportunity to take a fresh look at our policies, evaluates market changes, and convenes a series of roundtables like the one today that will delve deeper into these critical issues, no matter what options are discussed or what decision is ultimately made by this body. Let us all make sure that the impact on consumers remains at the center of the debate. Thank you very much, and I know you will have a great panel.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman and Commissioner Clyburn. My name is Roger Sherman. I'm the Chief of the Wireless Telecommunications Bureau, and to my left is Jim Schlichting, our Senior Deputy Chief for the Bureau. We'll be moderating this panel. I'd like to begin by welcoming everyone to our roundtable on mobile broadband and the open internet. In particular, I would like to thank our distinguished panelists for being here today, along with all of those here in person or watching online. Before I introduce our panel, I'm going to go over a few ground rules about the format for today's discussion. I apologize if it's repetitive for those of you who have been here all day, but this is a new panel. We're going to begin by asking each of our panelists to give a brief opening statement. Jim and I will then moderate a conversation among the panelists. We will consider a series of questions that the Bureau has prepared, and we'll also incorporate questions we receive from the public via written cards, emails, and tweets. At the conclusion of the panel, we'll have an opportunity for additional questions from any of the commissioners who wish to ask questions. One important note about questions from the audience, for both those here in person and those watching online. By submitting a question, you'll be making a filing in an official FCC proceeding. All information you submit, including names, addresses, and other personal information, will be available online. With that, I'd like to begin by briefly introducing the members of our panel and then asking each of them to make a short opening statement. So starting on this side of the panel, we have Sarah Morris. Sarah Morris is a Senior Policy Counsel for the Open Technology Institute at the New America Foundation. The Open Technology Institute promotes affordable, universal, and ubiquitous communications networks. To her left is Christopher Gutman-McCabe. Mr. Gutman-McCabe is Executive Vice President of CTIA, the Wireless Industry Trade Association. CTIA's membership includes wireless carriers and their suppliers, as well as providers and manufacturers of wireless data services and products. To his left is Dilara Derakshani. Dilara serves as Policy Counsel in Consumer Union's Washington office, where she's the lead advocate for the organization's telecommunications, media, and privacy efforts. Consumers Union is the Policy and Action Division of Consumer Reports. Next is Amalia Duloni. Amalia is the policy advocate for the Media Action Grassroots Network that works for media rights, access, and representation of historically marginalized communities. We then have Jonathan Spalter. Jonathan is the chair of Mobile Future, an association of technology and communications companies working to promote investment and innovation in the wireless space. And finally, Rosalind Layton. Rosalind Layton is a PhD fellow at the Center for Communications and Information Studies at Aalborg University in Copenhagen, Denmark. She is also currently a visiting fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. With those brief introductions, let's get started. We'll go in order, starting with Ms. Morris, if you'd care to begin.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm thrilled to be here today to talk about this very important topic. As a starting point, before we get to the question of platform parity, we must note that the Commission must implement strong open Internet rules, and that those rules must then be applied across all platforms. To achieve this end, we must start with the rules themselves, and the Commission's proposed rules should not be the starting point, as the current proposal does not adequately protect against blocking, discrimination harms, or prevent paid arrangements for prioritized or enhanced service. Indeed, the proposed rules would disrupt the fundamental open nature of the Internet, and that Internet users and innovators have come to expect. And furthermore, it will add an open Internet divide to the already entrenched digital divide. And on this open Internet divide, a lack of platform parity will have an enormous social and economic impact on the disproportionate share of young, lower income, and minority populations who rely primarily and often exclusively, as Commissioner Clyburn pointed out, on mobile devices to connect to the Internet. The data and the record in this proceeding are clear that traditionally disadvantaged groups, tens of millions of Americans, are not only much less likely to have a high-speed fixed broadband connection at home, they are also more than twice as likely to rely either solely or primarily on wireless broadband networks for their primary Internet access. This is not to say that access to the Internet through a mobile device is presently a workable substitute or workable solution to permanently closing the digital divide, but to the extent that many underserved populations currently rely so heavily on mobile as a primary or exclusive access point to the Internet, the Commission must protect that access by applying the same framework of open Internet protections to both wired and wireless markets. Platform parity also makes sense because the lines among platforms are blurring. Devices consumers use to access the Internet are increasingly mobile, but they will rely on connectivity from both mobile carrier and also primarily wireline networks, often moving back and forth between the two types of networks seamlessly during the same web session without interrupting the connection to a call, video, or other service. Wireless offloading is also increasing, and it would be impractical and undesirable to have a regulatory regime in place where a user moving among wired and wireless networks would be afforded different levels of protections over the course of potentially mere minutes. Finally, any technical distinctions among network architectures can be accounted for and should be accounted for under a reasonable network management standard. It is entirely feasible for the Commission to adopt a common regulatory framework that would also allow network management under that standard.
Mr. Gutman-McCabe.
Thank you, Roger, and good afternoon, Mr. Chairman and Commissioner Clyburn. On behalf of the wireless industry, I can report that CTI and its members are committed to delivering an open mobile internet to U.S. consumers. There is no need to radically change the regulatory framework that has delivered so significantly for U.S. consumers and companies, and indeed, a radical change to the current framework would put at risk the world-leading mobile ecosystem that U.S. consumers and businesses currently enjoy. In my opening remarks, I would like to highlight the following 3 points. First, mobile networks are different than fixed. Mobile broadband presents unique technical challenges that demand far more complex and aggressive network management than fixed broadband requires. Application of the same rules to fixed and mobile platforms would harm the quality of the customer experience, inhibit innovation, and remove consumer choice from the mobile marketplace. Second, the mobile broadband market is fiercely competitive, with providers consistently introducing innovative mobile product offerings. The record shows that internet openness is essential for any carrier seeking to win and keep customers, and that differentiation in service, far from weakening the open internet, benefits consumers. Third, any open internet regulation must steer clear of common carrier rules. A utility-based framework developed for a monopoly landline world would smother the fast-paced U.S. mobile ecosystem and jeopardize the incredible investment and rapid innovation that are its hallmarks. Some commenters in this proceeding have claimed that there is just one internet and that one set of rules should govern both fixed and mobile broadband, but these commenters miss the point. As the Commission concluded in 2010 and tentatively concludes in this proceeding, mobile is different than fixed. A single strand of fiber can carry 1,000 times more bits per second than an enormous 10 gigahertz radio channel. Limited spectrum resources, varying numbers of users at any one time, differing handsets with differing capabilities, differing spectrum bands, and differing technology platforms, and each user's constantly changing channel conditions are just a few of the unique challenges of managing a mobile network. Other commenters have argued that mobile broadband marketplace is no longer nascent or evolving. These commenters also miss the point. Mobile broadband is not mature. It is constantly evolving at an ever-increasing pace. New technology platforms, new devices, new applications, new services, and entire sectors of the economy are now migrating to mobile. This isn't a mature market. It is one in a constant state of reinvention and disruption. And from a marketplace standpoint, the contrast between mobile and fixed is stunning. While 85% of U.S. homes have at most 2 wire broadband options, 82% of Americans are served by 4 or more mobile broadband providers. The mobile ecosystem in the United States is the envy of the world. It is the envy of the world, and there are not too many areas of our economy where we can say that. Recognition that wireless is different has delivered unprecedented consumer welfare, corporate investment, and job creation. A revised prescriptive regulatory framework would undo this. It would frustrate mobile users and take consumer choice away. CTI and its members urge the Commission to maintain a regulatory framework that will foster continued growth and investment. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
My name is Delara Derek-Shani, and I serve as Policy Counsel at Consumers Union, the policy and advocacy arm of Consumer Reports. Consumers Union's mission is to work for a fair, just, and safe marketplace, and we have a long history of working to ensure that consumers have an open, affordable, accessible, and internet. We appreciate the opportunity to share the consumer perspective today. For consumers, a neutral net is one that allows them to access the full capabilities of an internet without service providers imposing their preferences or unfair pricing schemes. Consumers have told us loud and clear that they want strong net neutrality protections, and 58% of them have told us that they would like the government to ban paid prioritization deals. We're concerned about rules that would turn the internet into a pay-to-play environment where only those with the deepest pockets could guarantee delivery of content, and where broadband providers who charge for priority access to their customers could discriminate freely against any content, service, or application that they see fit to disfavor. We strongly believe that consumers should be able to benefit from strong net neutrality protections, whether they're at home accessing content on their home computer or whether they're accessing content on a mobile phone. And there are many reasons that the Commission should revisit its 2010 decision not to apply a full comprehensive set of net neutrality protections to mobile broadband services. There's widespread agreement that since 2010, consumer demand for data-heavy services has skyrocketed, and the average mobile user is shifting to these more heavy uses of data. Consumers today view online services as welcome additions and alternatives to traditional pay TV options, and they're increasingly using those mobile devices to watch video. Since 2010, wireless carriers have also demonstrated that they have an incentive and ability to engage in harmful discriminatory practices that threaten internet openness. And many of our concerns in the fixed broadband space are not different than the concerns that we have in the mobile space. Providers are increasingly getting rid of their unlimited plans and implementing data caps and exempting certain services from those data caps, a practice that we believe threatens the spirit of the open internet rules and allows carriers to pick winners and losers in the marketplace. Providers are also engaging in throttling practices without fully disclosing the instances in which consumers will have their speed slowed down. There's a clear need for and desire for consumers to have additional information. Consumers are paying increasingly high prices for broadband services, and they deserve to know the restrictions on the services that they've signed up for. Again, at Consumers Union, we believe it's absolutely essential for net neutrality protections to apply both to fixed and mobile broadband providers, and that consumers who use computers, smartphones, tablets are all deserving of strong net neutrality protections.
Thank you.
Thank you. So let me thank everyone who's in the room today, and I also want to thank all the people who are watching online. I know in particular there are hundreds of community leaders who are watching from Voices for Internet Freedom, including members of the Media Action Grassroots Network, Presente.org, ColorOfChange.org, 18 Million Rising, National Hispanic Media Coalition, and Free Press. You all deserve a big thank you for your hard work on the ground, leading the fight and reminding everybody that this conversation today is both inadequate and incomplete if it doesn't leave the Beltway. I want to extend a special thank you to the chairman, Commissioner Clyburn, and other FCC staff who have made this event possible, and thank you so much for the invitation. As mentioned before, my name is Amalia Deloney, and I'm here representing the Media Action Grassroots Network. We're a national network of 175 organizations working to advance the media rights, access, and power of what we'd call the 99%. Yesterday kicked off Latino Heritage Month, so it seems especially appropriate to open my remarks with a quote from Cesar Chavez, who once said, "The fight is never about grapes and lettuce, it's always about the people." First shared during the UFW boycott, the quote reminds us that there are real people and real lives that are at stake, and that we have a responsibility to ensure that the most vulnerable are protected. Just as the Great Boycott wasn't only about produce, the fight for the open internet isn't only about technology. It's about the thousands of individuals whose quality of life depends on a real and open internet, whether it's wired or wireless. From job applications to healthcare, federal benefits and online education, or even, in fact, the regulation of our immigration status or entrepreneurship, we rely on the internet. With low barriers to entry, we have the potential to access infrastructure that can support our work as artists and musicians. Alternate Roots knows this, a group that's based in the South, in fact spanning the South, a region hardest hit by poverty and with a powerful history of local self-reliance. An internet free from discrimination allows for truth-telling about police murders in communities like Ferguson, Staten Island, Oakland, and Sanford by organizations like Black Lives Matter, Million Hoodies, and Color of Change. And an internet without paid prioritization means that new civil rights organizations like Presente.org can fight hate speech with online advocacy. They can remove pundits who target migrant communities. And 18 Million Rising can harness the power of technology and social media to organize when Jeremy Lin was called racist names during an NBA game. Together, these organizations and more filed comments to the FCC on behalf of thousands of members across the country. They called on the Commission to adopt rules to protect their wireless experience. Given that our communities, the rural and urban poor, immigrant, tribal, and communities of color disproportionately rely on mobile broadband as our primary means of internet access, and because many of the digital divide initiatives suggest that mobile broadband is part of their solution, we believe the Commission must apply open internet rules equally to fixed and mobile broadband. Further, we believe the Commission must ground these rules, these protections with their Title II authority, and move forward with reclassifying broadband as a telecommunications service.
Thank you. Mr. Spalter.
Thank you, Roger and Jim, Chairman Wheeler, Commissioner Clyburn, my amazing fellow panelists, my fellow wireless consumers here and online. Last week in Las Vegas, Chairman Wheeler put our collective focus on the pivotal question regarding how best we can safeguard not just the open internet, but the open mobile internet. And he contemplated what's changed in the mobile ecosystem since the 2010 open internet rules were set. There are many answers, but here are just a few top lines. First, U.S. wireless network traffic has grown more than 8 times. Per consumer mobile data usage has soared by a factor of 15. And today, far beyond Farm Heroes and House of Cards streams, our now pervasive 4G networks transport life-saving innovations, including to millions of Americans now wearing mobile medical devices like my 11-year-old daughter, whose wireless-enabled insulin pump now makes her life with type 1 diabetes not only safer, but may even make it longer. Equally important to consider is what hasn't changed since 4 years ago. By and large, the amount of spectrum available to fuel mobile broadband expansion. The laws of physics haven't changed. One example, all usable commercial spectrum across thousands of licensees in America has less than 10% of the capacity of a single fiber optic cable. Also unchanged is the day-to-day reality of the open internet we enjoy. At least as far as I know, since the 2010 principles were set, there hasn't been a single formal complaint issued here at the Commission. But the debate before us really isn't whether there is or is not an open internet. The question is far more precise. Is now the time to allow more prescriptive regulations into the tent of mobile network management? And if we do, what would it cost consumers? What would it cost innovation? And the open internet we all value. Now, I've talked about the immutable laws of physics, but there's also an immutable law of technology's progress, and that is that the future will always surprise us. Does this Commission really know where the next life-changing innovation will come, or how network engineers will need to adapt to help make this progress possible and sustainable? Do we truly believe we can codify into regulation the blueprint for doing so? You know, I had a conversation just on Friday with a senior network engineer for one of our national carriers. And I asked her Chairman Wheeler's same question. What's different from 4 years ago? And her answer was that in the 3G world of 2010, she and her engineers would update the network configuration once a day. Today, given the volume and complexity of demands on our current networks, those updates now occur up to 6 times each minute, 8,640 times a day. Much has changed since 2010. And it only makes the apparent and absolutely important distinction between wireless and wired network architectures even more compelling. And my advice is simple. If it's not broke, don't break it. Sometimes the hardest, most progressive, and wisest choices we must make in public policy for the public interest and for consumers, in the interest of consumers, is actually to refrain from further action. Our open mobile internet today and tomorrow may depend on nothing less.
Ms. Layton.
I'm an American based in Europe who studies global broadband internet policy. There are some 7,000 academic articles on net neutrality. They are almost entirely theoretical. The most cited articles conflict about whether net neutrality is even needed. Many articles suggest ambiguous, if not negative, effects for this policy on consumers. Good regulation rests on an intellectual consensus of market failure. We don't have that today. In fact, I can't think of a worse case where a regulatory regime is justified with so little empirical or academic support. I was recently in Istanbul for the Internet Governance Forum. One of the key topics at the conference was zero rating. Many developing countries struggle with broadband adoption. Where a few dollars per month for a mobile broadband subscription is a hardship, zero rating programs are important. By allowing popular content and applications, whether local or global, to be included without counting towards the data cap, consumers have a low-cost, risk-free way to try the Internet. Thereafter, they upgrade to full subscriptions or they use free public Wi-Fi, libraries, or Internet cafes. A number of Internet activists came to me with one important message. Stop American net neutrality policy from impeding their economic growth. They told me about grandmothers in India who get online for the first time through zero-rated WhatsApp so they can talk to their grandchildren in the USA. A group in Sudan is trying to build an internet economy, and they need zero rating to build a critical mass of users. Dissidents in Iran rely on Facebook. A man in Nepal edited 6,000 entries on Wikipedia with a basic feature phone. American innovation delivered through these zero-rating programs is lifting people out of poverty. My fellow academics and I are trying to gather data on these programs, but we're in a race with efforts to try to outlaw them before we can even assess their impact. The U.S. has spent the last decade telling the world that the Internet should not be subject to telecom regulation, and it rallied countries against the ITU's attempt to take over Internet governance at the WICET conference 2 years ago. How will we have any credibility in the world if we implement Title II? This is exactly what authoritarian governments want us to do so they can justify their own efforts to control the Internet. My own research on utility regulation demonstrates the impact of policies such as Title II. Simply put, with the imposition of mandated access in European countries, the region plummeted from investing a third of the world's broadband capital a decade ago to less than 1/5 today. Capital that would have gone to Europe came to the U.S. instead. Meanwhile, the U.S. chose a market-led dynamic competition framework. Americans, who are just 4% of the world's population, have enjoyed nearly a quarter of the world's broadband investment for more than a decade. We may have an edge on mobile now, but our leadership is not assured. Capital will move to where it can get the best return. China has over 700 million smartphones and its own internet companies and apps to challenge our mobile ecosystem. There's no way we can counter this threat if our internet is governed by monopoly-era telecom regulations from 1934. We need a modern, flexible framework built for the internet age and dynamic competition.
Thank you all for those thoughtful remarks. We're going to start with some questions from Jim Schlichting.
Thank you, Roger. And I think where we're going to start, not surprisingly, is the whole question of reasonable network management in mobile networks. And that topic raises a number of interrelated issues. Obviously, the question of the technical or engineering aspects of mobile networks versus wireline networks. I'm not sure I heard anybody disagree with the fact that there are differences. The question is, how do you take them into account? How should the Commission take them into account? But where I'd like to start with is, apart from the technical or engineering, and that is the question of pricing, and because issues have been raised recently with regard to sort of whether some of the efforts that some of the carriers have done have been focused on pricing, and whether the pricing is really network management or whether, in effect, it's marketing. A lot of focus on unlimited plans. People sign up for unlimited plans, buy full-cost devices to keep their unlimited plans, and then that get changed out from under them, and the issue has been raised of, well, is that reasonable network management, as opposed to the technical or the engineering aspects of those issues. And the question is, is it legitimate to use pricing in terms of network management? And if so, is there any limitation on pricing that should be allowed as part of reasonable network management? And I figured, Chris, you probably feel that you want to take first shot. Wouldn't surprise me.
Thank you. Thank you, Jim. I guess so. I'll take off my CTI hat just for a second and put on the hat that I wore initially when I left school as an economist, and I think it's fair to recognize that pricing has always been sort of a demand side tool or lever that folks could use to in some way stimulate, or impact demand. From I think CTI's perspective, as we look at the activity, whether it's the Department of Justice or the commission, this commission under Chairman Wheeler, or the previous commission, there was a lot of focus on a desire to have 4 nationwide competitors. And I believe in order to sort of facilitate their continued growth and their continued success, you need to allow them to differentiate. And one of the ways that they differentiate, obviously, is in different pricing plans, different pricing packages. To the extent that they also utilize that as a way to manage use and demand in their network, and I believe that some of them, in fact, do, I think that's an additional element of why they do it. But part of it is, in fact, differentiation. And the reality is, from a consumer's perspective, and this goes to what Commissioner Clyburn had said, from a consumer's perspective, this differentiation, this ability to have sort of an all-you-can-eat plan or different tiered pricing, the ability to have different price points that satisfy different consumers, I think solves a variety of concerns, whether it be network management concerns or whether it be a desire of a carrier to serve the different types of customers that they have. And so we've seen an evolution of some carriers offering unlimited plans, some carriers offering a range of unlimited and other opportunities. The last time I checked, I counted 34 different types of price plans across the 4 nationwide carriers, all designed.
Yeah, I mean, let's give some other folks an opportunity. Obviously, you dealt not just with reasonable network management, but you went into the whole question of data tier pricing plans and the legitimacy or not legitimacy of that, which, I mean, I think some of the other folks on the panel have raised. I mean, Delora, you look ready.
Yeah, I'm ready. So obviously there are a lot of questions about what constitutes reasonable network management, but I think it's interesting that a lot of carriers are interpreting this as anything that allows them to mitigate the effects of congestion. They're given a lot of leeway to decide what's okay and what's not. And I recognize completely that there are inherent challenges with managing the speed and reliability, and that these are variable factors depending on your location and whatnot. But I think that a lot of carriers are taking it a step too far, and it seems that spectrum is used increasingly as a justification as to why unlimited plans are no longer sustainable, and yet at the same time as a reason that open internet protections shouldn't be applied to mobile carriers. So while we recognize that there are definitely operational constraints in place, I don't think it's a carte blanche for carriers to act in ways that are harmful to consumers. And I look forward to clarification on what exactly that issue means and what others think.
Okay. Jonathan, do you want to address in particular, I don't think Chris got to, are there any limitations on pricing? I think Chris was seeming to suggest that it's not clear whether there should be any limitations dealing with the reasonable network management focus.
And though there are many different views on what constitutes reasonable network management, I think to get to, as Chairman Wheeler asked us, from heat to light on this specific issue, the best focus group for this question isn't, in fact, we here at this panel. It's American consumers who have not only with transparent access to data service plans and the variety of choices that are available to them, who are going to be ultimately the best judge about what service plans, what pricing levels work or not. It is, I think, not just a given, but it is a fundamental challenge in keeping ahead of this very difficult capacity challenges that we're facing in the networks, to allow network managers, of course, to manage networks, but also to allow the product developers, marketers, and other parts of the mobile network provider infrastructure to also use other tools, including pricing. Various data tiers are all part of a mosaic of strategies that are allowing us thus far to keep slightly ahead in this ultra marathon that we're in about ensuring the best possible services for the greatest aggregate number of consumers in our country.
Sarah, would you be interested in addressing that particular issue? Or I noticed that in your statement you had raised the question on network management, that any network management practice that either prioritizes or degrades the functionality of one or more edge providers while treating comparable traffic differently should be a per se violation. So,
right. So we would advocate for based on in a scenario where there's a technical necessity to prioritize traffic. But as we said, we would advise the Commission to implement a rule that requires that carriers do it in an application neutral way.
Okay. And that's an approach, Chris, that basically takes into account the idea that there may be different technologies, wireless versus wireline, but is setting forth the principle based on applications that's a way to take into account the differences.
Sure. So I think if we're moving from the pricing side to the technical side of the discussion, the reality is that none of these network management practices come into play unless a cell site or a cell sector is some way congested. The idea being that supply has exceeded demand in that cell site or cell sector, and so the carriers are going to implement some practices that will be designed to make it more equitable for the entirety of the users in that cell site or cell sector. And I don't think anyone at this table disagrees with that. The idea being that to the benefit of the whole, operating the network is something that all the carriers do and should do. Unfortunately, there are times when our networks are congested, and the carriers attempt at those instances, millisecond to millisecond, to really manage the networks in a way that affords the whole, the entirety of the users, to enjoy the benefits of mobile broadband.
So the focus of the network congestion measures should be focused on a limited portion of the network, and as opposed to trying to manage it on a broader basis. Okay, no, that's helpful to understand. I'm not sure that some folks have been focused on that particular part of network management. Another aspect of network management is the question of transparency. Delara, you had mentioned the question in your statement with regard to the transparency is what consumers know and don't know with regard to any management techniques taken. And I think it's pretty public that CTI feels that its members have complied with the transparency provisions of the open internet rules that currently apply. I think you indicated in your statement that you thought that there were issues involved with regard to the transparency of network management practices.
So it's important to note, I don't think that transparency serves as a substitute for real, strong, open internet protections. It wouldn't somehow make it okay if I were to act in a bad way, just telling you that I was going to act in a bad way doesn't really justify that behavior. So I think that's important to note. But also, and I think the fact is that consumers aren't getting the information that they need right now in terms of what constitutes reasonable network management. Chris just mentioned that it may depend on whether a particular cell site has a certain number of users, but what does that mean to the average consumer? Do they understand that they could be impacted differently, whether they're in a highly densely populated area versus a rural area? Do they? I think consumers there are so many options available to them, and I think they struggle just with those decisions. But I think it's not enough, and nor is it a substitute for strong open internet protections.
So part of what the carriers have tried to identify, and we submitted a paper as well from Drs. Reed and Tripathi, was that the management of the network is something that, and Jonathan referenced this a little bit earlier, but that has evolved so dramatically in the past 3 or 4 years as we move to LTE that some of the algorithms are running and some of the decisions are being made literally millisecond to millisecond. And so what the carriers have identified as part of their transparency disclosures is, to show that when there is significant, blockage or trouble with a cell site or a cell sector, that they will institute, programs that they've identified what they were, designed to alleviate that congestion, designed to ensure that everyone can have an equal opportunity to get access to the services that they desire in a way that doesn't harm the network, doesn't harm all of the consumers, and to some extent, if that means evolving the network practices based on the unbelievable range of parameters that exist, whether it's weather, whether it's the type of device you have, whether it's the type of network you're on, what spectrum bands you're on. I mean, the range of variables that go into network management are pretty staggering, and so the carriers honor and put out all the information they can on network transparency, but the fact of the matter is that the actual process happens millisecond to millisecond all the time in wireless networks.
Well, so Chris, are you saying that in a situation where there's network congestion at a specific cell site, the network engineers have the ability to determine whether an unlimited subscriber is actually using a lot of capacity at that time, or are they being throttled or their speeds reduced, whatever the term may be, because they happen to be under that specific pricing plan? What can the network do? Can it get down to that level of granularity?
So I had hoped that we would be able to bring a network engineer to the panel, and unfortunately, I don't think I have that degree of capability. But the reality is, what the carriers attempt to do is be as equitable as they can. Each of the carriers do things a little bit differently. I think that gets to the notion that they each try to compete on network performance. At the core, they're all trying to deliver the best possible experience for all of their consumers. I think it's important that we get back to that and we note that it's in their best interests at all times to provide whatever access a wireless consumer wants. And as we've seen, the explosion in the usage illustrates the fact that consumers are happy with the service and the products.
What do consumers know about when they're slowed down or impacted, sort of what speeds are they going to get? Are they getting 2G speeds? Are they getting slightly reduced? You mentioned there's a lot of transparency and the consumer understands. The question of whether the consumer actually understands they're being subject to reasonable network management or what that means when they're subject to reasonable network management, is that something carriers are supplying to the consumers as opposed to just sort of a general understanding that you may be slowed down under certain circumstances? I guess that goes again to the question of transparency: is what is enough for the consumer to understand to be really transparent to consumers so they can exercise the choice that they have in this environment. So John, do you want to take that on? So give Chris a rest.
Yeah, sure. And I think one of the actual innovations of the usage of network management is that in modulating the higher usage consumers in specific cell sectors where there are specific constraint issues, by slowing speeds in order to accommodate the greatest aggregate number of users on that cell sector, it also creates potential incentives for specific types of consumers to potentially advance to higher data plans in cases where they've self-limited their data plans. It's also important to know that, as far as I understand in my conversations with network engineers, that the usage of modulation of speed in order to accommodate the greater number of users on a cell sector is focused again on accommodating not just a specific individual's usage of data, but it's also built into the LTE architecture. is the ability for LTE to manage innovatively the network according to different types of services where there could be potential for latency or jitter in different types of service, say two-way video versus text or voice, that the LTE standard actually can fluidly and dynamically make choices algorithmically and adaptively to make sure that the greatest number of services and the greatest number of users can enjoy the benefits of their plans dynamically and in real time in those specific cell sectors where there is congestion.
I'm not sure how that addressed transparency, but I understand your basic point with regard to that. The question of whether that builds into what Sarah was saying earlier with regard to, you're talking about different types of services with different QoSs. Mm-hmm. The question of whether, there's a lot of detail here, but whether a principle of if there's a different type of service or an app that people recognize requires a different QoS. Maybe I shouldn't put words in Sarah's mouth with regard to the question of whether there should be any differentiation between different, whether it's the same app with requiring the same QoS, but it comes from different service providers.
Well, and I think that, to be clear, what we advocated for in our comments is for a rule that treats like applications alike, so not prioritizing one type of video streaming service over another or one voice service over another. I still have not heard from the panel any reason why all of these different management practices, the discussion about which can't happen within the context of reasonable network management. What we have been arguing for is that the Commission adopt one common regime of rules that apply to all platforms, and that the distinctions among those platforms, the technical distinctions among those platforms, are accounted for within the context of the reasonable network management.
So you weren't, Mr. Spalter and Mr. Gutman-McCabe cited changes in network management practices since 2010. Mr. Spalter talked about the engineer he spoke with, and Mr. Gutman-McCabe talked about the study that CTI submitted. You're not convinced by those data points?
No, that's right. I mean, one thing that we haven't really discussed much yet is that the network management practices, because of the way that the networks have converged and evolved, they are now wireline and wireless networks are much more integrated. And as I noted in my initial comments, customers are moving seamlessly on and off, sometimes by choice and increasingly by design of the networks themselves. And wireless offloading similarly has played a role in reducing the amount. The reason that we are continuing to see an increase in speeds on over this network that Chris and Jonathan point out is based on the same finite availability of spectrum is that the technology has gotten better, and we've discovered ways to supplement the existing capacity on an LTE network, for example, with offloading onto wireless networks that are attached to a fixed line product.
Why don't I turn to a question that came in, Rosalind? Actually, okay, go ahead.
Yep. So can I add one other point
Sure.
on this discussion? I think it's an important discussion. I think that the Commission, in attempting to craft the right rule about reasonable network management, it speaks to a classic discussion about information problems. It's very difficult for regulators to gather all the information they need to craft the right rule, as we've talked about how much things change and to allow the flexibility. What I think maybe what we're missing in the discussion is that instead of focusing on trying to craft the perfect rule, should we instead focus on, is there evidence of a consumer harm? And that I think that might be an interesting question. The other issue which is important to understand is that as we hope to move towards a future where we have smarter networks, for example, in a 5G framework where the network is smart enough to know, it's an SMS, I only need to deliver this across a 2G standard, high-speed video takes 4G, and so on, and that the concern about having one standard for everything is it doesn't allow the network to be flexible to take advantage of these different technological differences. So it's not necessarily discriminatory, it just means that it's using the limited capacity in a more intelligent way. I would also like to point out that this commission had an Open Internet Access Committee, which had an excellent group on mobile broadband, where they brought up a lot of the challenges created through the different kinds of applications on the network. And I think this is one more area I'd like to encourage, that the way that content is formatted and encoded today is very inefficient. We can improve the capacity of networks by 50% by improving the way that we encode video, by improving a range of other things that will immediately allow consumer to have a better customer experience without adding the amount of networks we have and without making more restrictive rules about traffic management. So this idea of an ecosystem means that we need to ask the participation of all of the all of these different parties. So when we talk about platforms, it's also, the content providers. It's also, the transit providers. That there are different things that all these parties can do to improve how this network works. And I don't think that we can simply put it on one part of the value chain and says you're only responsible for the network working well.
Okay. I'll also point out, if I could, very briefly, and Sarah made a very important point, that in fact the technologies that are available to network managers to more reasonably manage networks have been advancing. Consumers are benefiting from those technological advances. But let's be very clear. There still is a huge runway of progress still yet to come in the evolution of our mobile network and mobile network architectures. We're on the cusp, potentially, of ascending to a world of 5G. There still are iterations of 4G yet to come. And as we advance towards those even higher and better standards, one of the catalysts, the wind in the sails, has been the commitment, the ascendant commitment of the mobile innovation community to continue to invest, to achieve continued progress in the evolution of our networks. Not only requires that investment, but it also requires an understanding by not only our technicians and our engineers, but by the innovation community in general, that there is indeed still a soundness in the principles that were advanced by this commission only 4 years ago, that wireless networks still are relatively in their technological infancy. We've got, optimistically, much progress in front of us, but to achieve that progress, to realize this optimistic vision, we must maintain and hew to the wireless is different standard that I think was wisely and presciently developed by this body in this building.
Where do you want to go?
Yeah.
Yes.
So many points to touch on. Everyone has offered really interesting remarks. I want to step us back, though, for a second and suggest that all of these questions, whether we're talking about reasonable network management, transparency, all of the intricacies of engineering and technical management of what a network takes, are interesting. They're interesting questions. They deserve thoughtful and robust answers, which people have shared today, but they're wholly separate from what the average person experiences. And I think that, that speaks to, one, of course, the need for the commission to really hear from real people in their communities and understand in plain language what transparency actually looks and feels like. What does it feel like to have a data plan that changes? What can you actually afford? What do you know you're getting? How do you use it? And so, I want to just remind everyone that Commissioner Clyburn opened the statement today talking about the 41% of people who are exclusively mobile users, the 56%, I believe she said, that are low income, and suggests that those numbers alone in this country suggest that this is a conversation that requires a different level of input. It requires a different level of definition when it comes to these very technical terms, and requires an informed set of rules that are actually based in lived experiences from people. Of course, for us, and what many people have shared today, we believe transparency is not a substitute for the open internet. There's many more things I could say, but just want to put a pause for a moment and say that this is one of the reasons why we need a process that actually brings in average, everyday users to talk about what's going on.
So I think that's, if I just follow up on that for a second, I think Commissioner Clyburn outlined a number of details about the evolving use of mobile broadband. And I think the statistics I have, I think from your testimony, Ms. Deloney, is that 47% of African Americans and 60% of Latinos rely on mobile phones as their primary internet access point. So I think I'd like to ask the question of the panel, given this increasing importance of mobile broadband, particularly for low-income consumers and communities of color, do you think that there's a need to have an open internet protection for mobile broadband that's at least as robust as those provided for fixed broadband?
I think absolutely, and I think that's, we've been in, as Amalia pointed out, really in the weeds, but what advocates in favor of platform parity in the open internet proceeding are asking for is simply the same set of rules, the same regime applied across all access points to the internet, while leaving flexibility to accommodate the distinctions among those technological platforms through the reasonable network standard. The fact that so many people within the populations of communities of color, low-income populations, are relying so heavily and often exclusively on mobile networks demonstrates that if we don't have parity across all platforms, we are going to have an entire millions and millions of people in this country that, based on the device that they primarily use and the network to which they primarily subscribe, are afforded no protections, while those who are able to afford robust fixed line connections in their home will be afforded protections under the open internet rules, assuming we have rules on one side and not the other.
So, Roger, I guess the statistics that you highlight, that the commissioner highlighted, that we at CTI highlight, to me illustrate exactly what has transpired and the benefits that have accrued since the commission adopted wireless-specific rules in 2010. So since that point in time, we have not had any formal complaints. We've had a 350% increase in the number of apps that are available to consumers. We've had a 30% increase in the amount of capital expenditures, the largest 3-year capital expenditure number in the history of our industry. We've had an explosion in the number of cell sites. We've had data usage take off. We've had communities of color and others really take advantage of the mobile platform. And all of that leads me to a different conclusion than one that you suggested, and it's that we really should be careful not to break this, that there is a risk here, and we've seen this risk play out in other parts of the world. I mean, Rosalind talked about it in her opening statement about how capital expenditures flowed quickly out of the EU when they chose a regulatory approach. And I guess I would say that we have an environment that has exploded to the benefits of consumers, to consumer welfare, to United States businesses, and it's happened under the exact environment of a mobile differentiated set of rules. And so for us, as we look at it, it's not that there should be a similar set of prophylactic rules with a reasonable network management exception. We live that exception all the time. That exception, that reasonable network, is our norm. And so for us, having a differentiated set of rules that really recognizes how staggeringly different wired broadband is from wireless broadband is extremely important, and it's extremely important to really make sure that we facilitate that continued innovation and investment. It can leave the country. It has in the past. There are other countries that do not get network capabilities introduced first like we do here, that don't have handsets introduced first like we do here, and that don't have applications. We have multinational companies that develop infrastructure equipment that have said if the United States becomes the anomaly, services will be introduced first elsewhere. And I assume that's absolutely not what anyone on this panel wants. There's a reason why mobile is so important. It's because we get the technology introduction first.
So it seems that we have two different viewpoints grappling on the same statistics. So at the CTIA in Las Vegas, Chairman Wheeler in his keynote pointed out that in 2010, when the mobile rules were written, there were 200,000 LTE subscribers, and today there are 120 million, with build-out covering 300 million Americans. And he posited the question that's in the record, have things changed that we need to reconsider the way we approach mobile broadband? In yesterday's New York Times, as I'm sure Mr. Gutman-McCabe knows, the president of CTIA, Meredith Baker, was quoted as basically saying the same thing that we just heard from you, that the growth of smartphones and LTE is the clearest evidence that we should retain a mobile-specific approach because it has worked so well for consumers. In other words, the 2010 rules should be left alone. I'd be interested to hear from our consumer advocates what they think about those choices.
So I think it's the opposite. I think as LTE becomes more prevalent and consumers are able to use these more data-intensive applications, there's more of an incentive on the part of carriers who, I would argue, are not always going to act necessarily in the best interest of consumers. I think there's more of an incentive on their part to put in place practices that could threaten not only consumer welfare but also an open internet. I think a good example of this is Verizon actually has recently implemented a new policy that only applies to LTE, or that it applies to LTE users when it didn't before, and I think a lot of these practices are increasingly being applied to those users as well, and if anything, it's more of a reason that we should be cautious about carrier incentives and what's to come.
I would also just add that as we've sort of danced around the evolution of the mobile markets didn't happen in a vacuum. It's not this thing outside of the rest of the internet that exists in the corner where things develop and evolve. It's actually evolved in a way that has converged with the wireline networks that exist throughout the country. And so, the explosive growth is both because of that convergence, I think, and also a reflection of the need to create rules that apply across, in a comprehensive way, across this increasingly integrated internet landscape.
Sorry.
I would just add to that, yes, I think for the average person, there's one internet. And when you're in the moment of desperation, when you know you desperately need the internet for all of these things for your family, from education to employment to health care, to adjusting your immigration status, to seeking social service and all of these different things, you're not thinking to yourself, oh, am I in a paradigm where I'm in the wireless or am I in fixed? You're just simply thinking you need the internet. I do think that, there are lots of instructional pieces from history that we can draw on. I'm thinking now of Lani Guinier and the canary in the coal mine. I think that it behooves us as a nation to protect those most vulnerable. And when we look at the people who are pushed on to the wireless internet, primarily because of price, we want that experience to be, in fact, the most protected. We want it to be the most democratic. We want it to be the most secure, so that as they move to a fixed wireless, they have a seamless experience, but they've also been introduced to a technology where they experience the fullness of all of the things the internet has to offer. It seems backwards to me to suggest that we might want to treat them as separate, and that we would want to overlook the real disproportionate impact of the folks who are unable to choose for a variety of reasons.
I couldn't agree more with Amalia. I think that the issue is, how do we actually get to how do we actually bring these equities to play? How do we make sure that those lower income, disenfranchised, left behind members of our society can in fact get that seamless and sustainable access to the benefits of particularly the mobile internet that they're using more and more of? And I would argue that the way to actually get there is, in fact, to understand, as we tried to do in a paper that we submitted to the FCC looking at the engineering implications of the mobile internet, that in an average cell sector, it takes only 5% of subscribers streaming YouTube to actually use the entire capacity of a LTE site. For Netflix, even at a very low bit rate, it's 2% of the user base. We need to put more emphasis on dynamism, on flexibility, on having a non-prescriptive approach by the Commission to allowing network managers to manage traffic, manage the networks in a way to achieve exactly the goals that you outlined of making sure that the widest number of users in any cell sector, in any community, can gain access to the greatest technical human possibility. And I would also say that this, by maintaining the standard that wireless is different, is indeed, Commissioner Clyburn, not according it a lower standard to mobile services. In fact, I would say that continuing to give network managers that flexibility and dynamic ability to manage networks is in fact a much higher standard because it will get us all to the goal of an open, dynamic, free internet that will have the greatest impact for the greatest number of consumers in our country.
Can I ask a question of the panelists? Does anyone on the panel think that wireless is not different? Would anyone argue that wireless is not unique or different for network management purposes than wireline?
It is different, but it doesn't justify all of the practices that are being put in place.
So if we assume that wireless is different, everyone agrees that wireless is different, can't we get at the issues you're concerned about by just having a different approach to reasonable network management? Can't we have the same protections with regard to content and blocking, but the details of reasonable network management be more flexible based on the different networks?
Right. We seem awfully mired in the reasonable network management discussion, and the reality is that absent new rules, a network operator could decide to block certain content over the network. They could substantially degrade deliberately for reasons that are not related to network management the delivery of content online from one or more services. They could prioritize content from one or more services in a way that's not related to reasonable network management and is instead related to the business interests of the parties at play and the desire to extract additional rents in the market. Those are all things that throughout the open internet proceeding that we all seem to agree are important things to protect against. And we can quibble about the details, but to suggest that no rules at all are necessary in the wireless landscape, I think, is short-sighted.
I would just say one thing, Sarah.
Yeah.
Despite the absolute absence of any legally enforceable rule since 1996 Telecommunication Act, when I had the opportunity to work in the Clinton White House, since the absence of any enforceable rule, till today, no ISP in the mobile side has sought to promulgate or advance or implement any such anti-consumer approach. And if they do, they know full well that consumers are actually front and center and will make very reasonable choice with their feet in their checkbooks to seek other alternatives. And that has been an enormously effective check in the promulgation not only of the of increased mobile adoption, but also in the success of the American experience and the American experiment with this fantastic, brilliant innovation, which is 4G LTE.
I would point to one example, which is the AT&T's decision to block FaceTime on certain plans and certain devices on their network in 2012, which several public interest groups pushed back against. The process stopped short of filing a formal complaint, but for months and months, consumers were left without access to a service that they wished to access on a certain network over a certain device. So I would disagree with you there.
Well, but I think it's fair to point out that service and that issue that you identified was a new product with a new operating system on a new network that a carrier was deploying and rolling out, in sort of a piece-by-piece process on its network. Roger, you asked the sort of the threshold question of why shouldn't we or couldn't we have a baseline set of rules and then have a reasonable network management exception. And for a nanosecond, I'll go back to my concern that the exception would swallow the rule in the sense that reasonable network management is a norm. It's an everyday occurrence for us. But I don't think I can repeat too often, and this goes to Jonathan's point as well, which is what is the harm that has happened? What is the harm that has been identified that suggests that we as a society and you as policymakers should put at risk what is, by all accounts, the most prolific, the most innovative market, not just in the United States in terms of wireless in the United States, but wireless in the world. And so my concerns could almost begin and end there in that we are contemplating changing the framework by which we look at wireless services, permissionless innovation, both at the edge and at the core. And we are contemplating rewriting that to the point where we could harm not just consumers, not just carriers, not just infrastructure vendors, but everything that we're contemplating, all the vertical sectors going forward. And so that's why you see a passion here on our side.
Ms. Deloney, do you have an answer to Mr. Gutman-McCabe's question?
Well, I think it's interesting to talk about putting the market at risk, because I think we would ask, do we protect the market at the expense of communities and people? And I think the answer for us is clearly no, we don't. We want to actually start from the place of the most vulnerable folks. We want to look at their experiences, and we want to make sure that we protect them with the strongest protections possible, which we feel comes from strong open internet protections on mobile and wireless, which we feel comes with reclassifying broadband. I think all of these pieces are interesting, whether we're talking about, putting a market at risk or asking about, systems that are broken. I think all of them, though, can be turned on their head, and we can ask, who in fact is bearing the burden, and it's people, not, it shouldn't be the corporations that we're trying to protect. It should be the individuals and the people who are using the products.
If I could, Chairman Wheeler has a comment for the panel.
Thank you, Roger. I just wanted to ask the panel on the point that you've just been discussing. The CEO of Verizon said that he would abide by mandatory platform parity between mobile and wired in a Wall Street conference last week. And this morning we asked the Verizon representative on another panel to elucidate on that. And the answer was yes, we would agree to platform parity. So, Chris, the kind of concerns that you raised that we're killing the golden goose, it would appear the largest carrier says that may not be the situation if there was a recognition of reasonable network management. So it now takes us back to that issue, okay? But if we stipulate the fact that at least one carrier has said yes, if, then let's go to what the if is. And the discussion that we've been having here, that you've been having here, which is fascinating, where you talk about network functionality. Now, every network has management issues. Networks always manage to the millisecond. There's nothing special in wireless to that effect. We heard Cisco talk this morning about the realities of routing, which apply to all networks. Jonathan raised the point about a very small percentage of users clogging up a network. That's basic Erlang issues. Those are the issues that go back to Alexander Graham Bell and the twisted pair. There's a simple process that we've learned to deal with those kinds of capacity issues. I've heard the argument today that fiber has 1,000 times the capacity of 10 megahertz of spectrum, but I'm not sure how that's relevant because consumers don't buy and couldn't use a full fiber. What we've been saying is 25 to 100 megahertz is what you need as table stakes for the 21st century, and that's what LTEA provides. And so that's what we ought to be measuring. And so the question then becomes, okay, if at least one major wireless carrier says we can have parity if there's reasonable network management, and if we know the network management and reasonable network management has existed through the history of telephony and has proven tools like Erlang management to the millisecond, etc., what can this panel do to shed some light on just what is the kind of reasonable network management that ought to circumscribe platform parity between wireless and wired, if at all?
Would anyone like to take that? Start.
So if I speak...
Rosalind, we haven't heard from you in a while. Do you want to?
Yeah, let Rosalind go first.
Thank you, Chairman, for that. I appreciate you keeping us on track here, because that is I will agree that it seems defendable to say, that there should be an exception for reasonable network management. I would cast the net a little bit wider, because I want to follow up with what Sarah said about the platforms. And I don't think this is a small point. I think it's an important point that we shouldn't miss. We have a focus on this open internet discussion about the physical networks themselves. The internet value chain that every consumer experiences today takes into account platforms, which are search engines and social networks, and extreme amount of all of these companies getting into each other's businesses. So, for example, for that reason, the government in France is exploring promoting an idea of platform neutrality, which is across the entire internet value chain. It takes into account the devices and the internet companies, the networks, and so on. And so, there is a solution. There is a conclusion to all this about how would you look at it. But at any rate, to simply boil this all down to this is fixed versus mobile. If we really understand the consumer, we would need to embrace that entire experience they have with the device, on the websites they visit, all of those things. I would suggest there is a way to look at it, and that's through a case-by-case, a competition-based approach where all the problems that we talked about today, whether it's discrimination, refusal to supply, bundling, all those kinds of issues, competition law can deal with. And the point of that is you can actually establish a credible case if there's consumer harm. The parties who have a problem are able to provide that. So, so that would be the way that I would go forward with it, is that I would support that we should have one standard for everything. We shouldn't make a distinction between wired or wireless, but then we need to cast the net across the entire internet value chain where people are every single day.
And I'd also add that I think that to your question, how do we develop a single network management standard encompassing all platforms, all services, might be an achievable mental exercise in today's world. But I think the core of that question really isn't about today's world. It's about the, by definition, unimaginable, unanticipated new types of services and requirements that particularly mobile networks will face next year, 5 years, 10 years from now. We have a pretty close look at where we're going, we hope, in the evolution to 5G. But we know, as our colleague from Cisco, as earlier panels discussed in conversations about other types of specialized services, one of the greatest transformations that network managers are going to have to anticipate and deal with is not how do we provide a reasonable network management approaches for animate users, but rather inanimate users that are going to be, if John Chambers is right, numbered in the 5 billions wireless sensors connecting to the network. I would submit that the question that you posed, Chairman, is there a single standard that can encompass and embrace all iterations of the internet value chain, is one that's it's one that potentially could be complicating to the evolution that I'm talking about.
Let me clarify, John, because I wasn't saying something that would encompass all parts of the internet ecosystem. I was saying, what is the definition of reasonable network management for wireless carriers? Understanding that it's Internet of Things. Understanding that it's all those kind of things that we've yet to imagine. Okay? You're reformulating my question to make it much broader than it was.
So I'll take, Mr. Chairman, a shot at the narrow question at the risk of someone interpreting that I'm disagreeing with one of my largest members at CTIA. So I'll say up front, I am not necessarily disagreeing with one of my largest members. But when we went through this exercise in 2010, one of the things that one of the conclusions that came from it was the idea that, my goodness, to insert the Commission into the day-to-day analysis of what reasonable network management is, particularly as these services are evolving so quickly, is something that I'm not sure, A, the Commission is capable of doing, and B, I'm not sure it's something they should be in the process of, or in the business of doing. But I guess I would, so I'll posit a question to your question. If we had done this exercise in 2008 and said, what is reasonable network management, we wouldn't have had, in essence, we would have had a brand new, but basically not an iPhone, no apps, no tablets, no LTE, no verticals. We wouldn't have had any of the two auctions that, thank you, are coming down the pike in the next 12 to 18 months. We wouldn't have had LTE Advanced. It would have been a completely different environment. And as we look at a set of prophylactic rules followed by a reasonable network management exception, there is a fear that the exception becomes, obviously swallows the rule, but also becomes something where post hoc, these millisecond to millisecond decisions are being called into question. And I do say that does cause concern across the range of companies, both carriers and infrastructure vendors that we've talked to.
So Chris, I can't accept your hell will freeze over analogy, okay? But the question I'm asking is, let's not argue here about whether hell's going to freeze over or not. Okay? And maybe this isn't the panel, but if people keep saying, okay, platform parity makes sense if we can recognize the uniqueness of the network, and the uniqueness of the network is not Erlang management, is not millisecond management, is not 10,000 times 10 megahertz, what are the reasonable network management issues that we need to be aware of? And so I'm asking the industry what this question is. And I know, well, period.
Move on to.
I think if the consumer were to end up receiving anything that they had not expected under what they had paid for, that would inherently be unreasonable. That's my consumer perspective, but that's a $10 million question. I think if any of us answered it, we'd do that.
I think within the context of reasonable network management, the fundamental thing that we as advocates, consumer advocates are concerned about is that reasonable network management, if drawn too broadly, starts to allow certain business practices where the motivation for decisions about how to manage network congestion or how to manage the network more broadly are not always related to answering from a technical standpoint the congestion question, and are sometimes used, as we saw in the FaceTime issue, to based more on business decisions than on technical necessity.
I think we wanted to move for the remaining time, since we're getting closer to the end, to evolving business models, which I think raises in our mind both the questions of the change from unlimited data plans to more tiered data plans, also raises the context of sponsored data plans, zero rating, and all that sets of issues, with regard to that. I guess I'd start with asking the panel the question in terms of on zero rating policy. There are a lot of arguments made at a panel earlier today, both in favor of zero rating and against zero rating. And I guess the question is, or at least one question is it any different for mobile in the context of that, in the sense that zero rating not being put forward as a method of reasonable network management, is there really any difference from a public interest perspective for zero rating policy for mobile versus fixed?
Sorry, I guess I'm a little bit confused. Are you asking, should there be different rules? I will start by saying zero rating is sometimes a confusing term, because a lot of these business arrangements mean different things in different contexts and involve different types of arrangements, some for pay, some for not. If you want to start from zero rating generally and where you're coming from with regard to, because there've been a lot of
positions, paid prioritization, zero rating, user-driven, paid prioritization. If you want to address that more broader question, that's fine.
So Rosalind mentioned earlier zero rating in the context, largely the international context, and in less developed countries, as a sort of proxy for what we would hope to see would be the widespread broadband build out in those countries. Where it hadn't happened, carriers were partnering with certain applications to provide what they can essentially over the network infrastructure that they have. To me, that's sort of beyond the scope of this panel here, because those countries are, while whatever decisions we make in the United States as a matter of federal policy will necessarily have some impact on the rest of the world, they're not within our immediate jurisdiction for this question. But if we're talking about sponsored data arrangements in the United States, I think that generally speaking, there is a concern that, as Delara mentioned earlier, that those threaten the openness of the internet that we are all trying to protect. Now, is that to say that every potential arrangement among application providers and internet service providers raises the same level of concern? Probably not. I think that there's different forms that these can take, but I don't think that we need to sort of litigate here all of the different arrangements that can happen in order to, come up with a sort of agreement about what the best practices should be.
If I could just give some real-world color to our very short experience with sponsored data programs in the context of mobile networks, to answer your question, Jim. Well, first of all, there's a golden thread that goes back to the concept of sponsored data to 1967, when AT&T actually advanced the first 1-800 numbers, and I don't think there's a consumer alive who hasn't benefited from that platform. Apples and oranges, of course, but let's take it to our current world and the concerns that have been raised about sponsored data. Concern number one, sponsored data would only inure to the benefit of larger corporations that are going to essentially push out or foreclose the opportunity for startups or younger companies of the types that I've been affiliated with professionally to succeed. In fact, since January, when AT&T launched its sponsored data program, the four entities that are actually using the innovative new business model are all earlier stage companies providing, they think, differentiated value to consumers. It could be, if we allow it to flourish, this one flower to bloom, a potential vehicle for smaller entrants to actually compete in innovative, fresh, and different ways from larger incumbents that might actually work. We don't know yet. And I think before we pursue regulatory approaches to the evolution of sponsored data initiatives and other types of business services and products that might come online, let's realize two things. One, no provider is suggesting that those sponsored data programs are going to contravene our commonly understood open internet principles: make speeds faster, make speeds lower. And two, they actually might, going back to the consumer perspective, which is what we always have to put right in front of our minds, be opportunities for more consumer choice, more consumer value, and greater consumer access to content that they might not otherwise have gotten. It's a very, very good point to make about the international experience, and there are lessons to learn. And all we need to do is go and look at what happened in Chile, where zero-rated services trying to provide services to lower-income individuals, because there were stronger net neutrality regulations in place at the regulator subtel, were shut down. I think that's an evolution that's not taking us in the right direction.
Consumers Union, we do have a position on this. I think we're worried that these sponsored data plans will take meaningful choice out of the hands of consumers and put it into the hands of providers. They can decide what is appropriate, what counts, what doesn't, according to private negotiations in a back room, without little opportunity for the consumer to meaningfully contribute. And I think a lot of these offers are couched as pro-consumer, but I think that they're not.
Deloney?
Yeah, I was going to just add, I was fortunate to be in Brazil earlier this summer, where zero rating is something that's very prevalent. And in fact, the minute I got off the airplane and was moving through the airport, I was offered a foreign plan for my cell phone. The foreign plan that you buy, anywhere between 1 month, 6 weeks, depending on how long you're in the country, was sold to you under that with the strong advertising that you would be able to access Facebook and Twitter exclusively for free. It wouldn't impact your data plan for the entire time you used it. It was sort of surprising for me to see that. I hadn't seen it in the U.S. Spending more time in Brazil, though, I realized that it's not just the foreign plans that are offering this. Pretty much all of the mobile plans are offering this. And it wasn't very hard to go into the favelas and understand that people were using these zero-rating plans as their only access to the Internet. So much so that in Portuguese, being on the Internet and using the Internet is synonymous with saying Twitter and Facebook. To people who are using these devices, they do not. That is the Internet for them. It's the only Internet they can afford, and I think that that's highly problematic. Again, I mean, on one hand, people can argue that it is access. On the other hand, I think the analogy we came up with is it's being, you're being brought onto the Internet that's a private shopping mall when what you really want is a public park. You want the fullness of what the Internet can offer. You do not want an experience that's only mitigated by Twitter and Facebook. I think it's incredibly dangerous to think that sort of experience is the Internet when it's not. And I think we need to understand the role that zero rating plays in that.
So I don't necessarily disagree with any of that at all, but I think if you look at whether it's zero rating or sponsored data within the United States, there are significant range of different product and service offerings, and to a large extent, some of these opportunities, some of these different service plans may be beneficial to consumers. They may allow carriers to differentiate their service, allow a range of consumers who have a specific focus on a specific service or website to be able to get access to that. And in the United States, at least, we know that there are a range of other alternatives to consumers, even within each individual carrier or with carriers as a whole.
I would just say that I agree that there is a range of types of plans offering, and the cost-benefit analysis of each might be different. But I would just echo the sort of underlying concern that underscores our concern with threats to network neutrality across the Internet, and that is that Internet service providers, whether wired or wireless, have a tremendous gatekeeper power that Amalia just highlighted with a very poignant story. And we need to be very careful about that, and we need to recognize that it exists and make sure that we are not allowing it to dictate the consumer experience for users across the country.
Did you have a final quick point?
Sure. I think that it's important to, I think, Jonathan, he was mentioning this 1-800 notion, but actually the notion about having other participants fund the development of content, this goes back a century. When we think about how do we ever enjoy radio, TV, or print in this country was because we had advertising support. We made a choice in the United States that we didn't want to put the burden on consumers to fund the entire development of the television network. In other countries, they have compulsory media license fees for how you can get content, and if you don't pay those fees, it's a fine. So it's actually a way, for me, it's a bit puzzling. I would think consumer advocates would want to have other people bear the burden for the end consumer cost. And for example, a lot of the things we're seeing with sponsored data are around health information, so people can watch videos on their mobile phone to learn about different kinds of ways to improve their health. And that the health insurers, for example, have an incentive to get their members to watch these things, and then also improves the health outcomes of the people involved. So in the big picture, net neutrality, the concern I have from academic perspective is basically saying that the only people who can bear the cost of the network are consumers, that we're not going to allow the other participants who are enjoying the network to contribute. And I think that that's kind of unfair that we put all the burden on consumers when there are definitely, probably the platforms, the Google, Facebooks of the world, they're the most profitable. I'm not saying they're the ones there. That's not what I'm trying to suggest. But at any rate, if we look at the development of all the media in the United States, we have allowed other parties to help consumers get access to the content in the media, not leave the burden just on consumers.
Thank you. Thanks, sir.
Well, does it make any difference if on the zero rating that there's some affiliation or between certain of the applications or whatever that are being zero rated, or, and they're competing against other applications and the like? There's zero rating if there's no corporate connection and the like. There's perhaps a different one if the company that's doing the zero rating or paid prioritization or whatever is actually in a situation where it's competing against another product.
I think same concerns as in the fixed broadband space. Right. Vertically integrated providers have more of an incentive to discriminate against these emerging competitors, for example. And I think it's no different in this case in the mobile space, especially when a lot of carriers are introducing new apps on their own behalf.
Go ahead. Another point, actually go ahead because I was going to change the subject slightly.
No, I was just going to make the very quick point that your premise is whether or not there should be anti-competitive practices embedded in the conduct of sponsored data programs or initiatives. And I think clearly the answer has to be absolutely not. And when there are, I think there are adequate agencies here in Washington, in my home state of California, where I live, across the country, that will and can address those instances, and I hope address them firmly.
Go ahead.
So actually, I think Chairman Wheeler put it aptly at the CTI show. There may be competition, but that doesn't prevent a carrier from engaging in practices that are anti-open internet. And for that same reason, I don't think antitrust laws, for example, or competition concerns alone are enough to address a lot of these harms that we've been discussing. So I just want to throw that out.
Oh, the point I was going to raise as well is that in the mobile context, the sponsored data plans, particularly when they involve sponsored delivery of content like streaming music, start to also undermine the arguments that carriers have made historically about the need for data caps. So if you're able to stream one streaming music service without interfering with your cap limit, for example, then which is one sort of arrangement that we've talked about, then it starts to sort of undermine the arguments about the need for data caps as an effective network management tool more broadly.
But in this particular instance, it's actually a company that is trying to take advantage of the additional capacity that they hopefully had and are trying to create a differentiation in the marketplace in order to attract consumers. So, it's a product that is designed to find a niche within their customer base, and it will be or will not be successful, but it is specifically designed to offer a product that they think their consumers want that will work on their network. I mean, I think, again, we have to go back to the point that carriers don't manage their networks to the benefit of an inanimate object. They manage their networks to the benefit of their customers. It's never, ever, ever in their interest for their networks not to work. And so everything that they do is designed to make it a robust experience. And if they don't, and we've seen this, they will lose customers.
I disagree with that. I think it's possible for carriers to act in more subtle ways that may not necessarily be detectable by a consumer or by the commission even, for no reason other than that it's difficult to monitor and enforce these things.
But Delara, you've mentioned a lot of coulds and mights and mays, but there hasn't been a lot of they have or they are doing these things. And so, again, it does come back to, and I know Rosalind mentioned this, but it does come back to our concerns that we are contemplating, and Mr. Chairman, you phrased it, hell freezing over. But I do have that background as an economist. I have seen capital flow away, and so have you. And there is a fear that we are setting up an environment where capital will go in the wrong direction. And then the negative impact will be on consumers. There is a reason why there is such significant consumer uptake of our products.
I wanted to sort of get back to what the chairman was suggesting in terms of reasonable network management and how reasonable network management will work in the mobile context. I mean, I think there's been some sense that the wireless carriers have been totally free in what they've been able to do in the context of reasonable network management, how they manage their networks. But there has been on the books the open C-block, open access C-block rules for Verizon, which have involved some at least conversations with Verizon with regard to enforcement and the like. So they have been dealing with a situation where there have been limitations on their ability to what they connect and not can connect, don't connect with regard to it. And they seem to have been able to do quite well in the context of a somewhat limited ability to manage their network. So I think what the chairman was getting at is the context. In the context of the mobile wireless on a going forward basis, can't we come up with some principles with regard to reasonable network management that places perhaps some limitations on it? What can we put together that makes sense, that doesn't cause hell to freeze over or kill the goose that lays the golden eggs, but deals with some of these other issues and the like. And I think that's what he was putting to the panel, and not just for now, but obviously over the course of, we can't say for very long because we're moving very quickly with regard to this. Did want to go to at least one question that we got from the outside earlier today that goes to this panel. And I think I know the answer from some of the panelists, but this was from an Alexander, affiliated with E Pluribus Unum, and the question of whether can or should the FCC collect data or proactively monitor mobile broadband to detect prioritization or discrimination prior to the harm in the marketplace. To the extent that the panelists would like to address that, that might be helpful. Whether there, as I say, from the industry side, I think I know what your answer is. I don't know whether that any of our consumer panelists think something like that should be in the FCC's toolkit or not.
Can I hear the question one more time? I'm sorry.
Right. Can or should the FCC collect data or proactively monitor mobile broadband to detect prioritization or discrimination prior to harm in the marketplace, which I think goes to or is it only ex post, which I think is what Jonathan was talking about as a way of dealing with these issues.
So there already are tools to collect information about network management practices online, or at least carrier behavior. My organization is a partner in building one called Measurement Lab, and so we think that good data collection, when executed in a way that protects users, is a really important part of policymaking.
I think that I'm not this. Perhaps I don't know if this is what the Alexander's getting at, but there can be kind of civil concerns, and this has come up in Brazil with their law, this Marco Civil de Internet, where the carriers are required to maintain records on their customers for a period of time, which is accessible to the government. And a number of privacy advocates have criticized this as a bad idea, that you would proactively monitor networks or collect data, that it sets up a very difficult, it puts a regulator in a difficult situation. So, the way I read that question is, are we entering maybe a risky area where we would be exposing citizens or people to surveillance because of doing these proactive checks? I think it's definitely a concern. I don't know if it's perhaps the context of this panel necessarily.
I would just add that it starts to sound a little bit like, just trust the carriers and all the innovation will happen, but we can't actually ask them about the reasonable or the network management practices that they're employing or seek to understand them. So I would, I agree with the point that Delara made earlier that transparency is not enough, but certainly blind trust in a vacuum is, I don't think is the right answer either.
And I do think that there are other ways of actually encouraging and promoting the type of transparency that we are all hoping will be embedded increasingly in the mobile innovation ecosystem, which is essential to the proliferation of the open internet and consumers' experience. I don't think, however, from a consumer's perspective, the idea of the United States government through the FCC acquiring more data that necessarily could potentially track back to individual consumer preferences or choices or behavior is something in this climate or in any climate is going to be preferable to consumers.
Well, I was just going to say, I appreciate the question and what I'm reading into it, which is really this value placed on data as a way to sort of mitigate harm or understand what's going on. I think that there are other ways to build trust in the network, and I think one of them is making strong open internet protections on mobile and fixed broadband. So I want to make sure that we don't go down a path that we often do in policymaking, which is feeling like there's one more data set out there, one more study we can do, one more way of slicing and dicing an issue that we have to engage in before we can take decisive action.
Well, we're just about out of time. I want to thank all of the panelists for your answers. This has been a very lively and informative discussion for us, and I'm sure for the audience and the viewers online. And with that, we'll
There's our two bosses.
yeah. Okay. With that, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I didn't see the chat.